Good evening and welcome. Tonight, we will spend some quiet time exploring a mystery that unfolded far from busy cities, in a place shaped by wind, sea, and isolation. The events took place on a small group of rocky islands off the coast of Scotland, where a lighthouse stood as a solitary structure against the surrounding Atlantic Ocean. It was a location defined by silence and distance, where daily life followed strict routines shaped by weather and responsibility. Yet within that quiet environment, something occurred that would leave lasting questions and a mystery that has never been fully resolved. If you are new here, this channel is designed for calm listening and relaxation. The stories are told without dramatic intensity or disturbing detail, so you can unwind, focus, or fall asleep comfortably while learning about real historical events. Many listeners use these videos as part of their nighttime routine because the steady pacing helps the mind settle. If you find this kind of content helpful, you are always welcome to subscribe and leave a like, as it supports the growth of the channel and helps others discover peaceful, long-form storytelling. The case we are exploring tonight involves 3 lighthouse keepers who were assigned to maintain a beacon intended to guide ships safely through dangerous waters. Lighthouse work required discipline, attention, and resilience, particularly in remote locations where contact with the outside world could be limited for weeks at a time. The men stationed there were experienced workers, accustomed to routine and responsibility. However, at a certain point, communication with the mainland stopped, and when others finally arrived to check on the situation, what they found raised questions that would continue to be discussed for more than a century. Mysteries that occur in isolated places often capture the imagination because there are fewer witnesses and fewer immediate explanations. When events unfold far from populated areas, uncertainty can grow quickly, and interpretation becomes shaped by both evidence and speculation. In this case, the environment itself played a role in shaping how people understood what might have happened. The sea, weather, and landscape all contributed to a sense of unpredictability that still surrounds the story today. As we move through this narrative together, you may notice how human perception responds to isolation and uncertainty. Environments that are quiet and remote can heighten awareness, making small changes feel significant. Whether the explanation lies in natural forces, human behavior, or circumstances that simply went unseen, the events remain a reminder of how quickly routine can be interrupted, even in places that appear stable and controlled. For now, allow yourself to settle comfortably. You might take a slow breath, relax your shoulders, and let the rhythm of the narration guide your thoughts into a calmer place. There is no need to focus on every detail. You can simply listen as the story unfolds gradually, while the quiet of the night continues around you. The Flannan Isles are a small group of rocky islands located in the Atlantic Ocean, approximately 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis in Scotland's Outer Hebrides. From a distance, they appear as dark shapes rising from the sea, surrounded by powerful waves and changing weather conditions. The islands are uninhabited, with steep cliffs and limited landing areas that make access difficult even in calm conditions. For much of history, they remained largely untouched, except for occasional visits by shepherds or fishermen who were familiar with the challenges of approaching their shores. The environment of the Flannan Isles is shaped by isolation. Strong winds sweep across the rocks, and the sound of waves striking the cliffs is constant. Weather conditions can change rapidly, shifting from calm to storm within a short period of time. In such a place, there are few visual references beyond the sea and sky, creating a sense of separation from the mainland. Individuals working in remote locations like this often develop routines that provide stability, as predictability becomes essential for both safety and mental well-being. Despite their harsh conditions, the islands held practical importance because of their position along shipping routes. The surrounding waters were known to be hazardous, with submerged rocks and unpredictable currents posing risks to passing vessels. During the 19th century, increasing maritime traffic made it clear that a lighthouse was necessary to help guide ships safely through the area. Navigation aids were crucial in reducing accidents, and authorities recognized that a permanent beacon on the islands could prevent future tragedies. Construction of the lighthouse began in the late 1890s under the supervision of the Northern Lighthouse Board, the organization responsible for maintaining navigational safety in Scottish waters. Building on the island required transporting materials across open sea and lifting them onto steep terrain, which involved significant effort and coordination. Workers faced challenging conditions during construction, including wind, exposure, and limited shelter. When the lighthouse was finally completed in 1899, it stood as a symbol of human determination against the forces of nature. The lighthouse itself rose approximately 75 feet above sea level, positioned to provide maximum visibility to passing ships. It included living quarters for the keepers, storage rooms, and mechanisms required to maintain the light. Daily operation depended entirely on the men assigned to work there, who were responsible for ensuring that the beacon remained functional regardless of weather conditions. The role required discipline and attention to detail, as even small oversights could create danger for vessels navigating nearby waters. Life on such a remote island demanded psychological resilience as well as technical skill. Lighthouse keepers often worked in rotations, spending weeks away from family and mainland life. Communication was limited, usually depending on supply ships that arrived periodically with provisions and updates. Isolation can affect individuals differently, with some adapting comfortably, while others experience loneliness or emotional strain. Maintaining routine tasks, regular schedules, and cooperation among co-workers was essential for preserving stability in such environments. For the Flannan Isles, the lighthouse represented both safety for sailors and a challenging workplace for those assigned to maintain it. The structure stood alone against the Atlantic winds, surrounded by the sounds of the sea and the constant movement of weather. It was a place defined by routine and responsibility, where the keeper's presence ensured that ships passing through the darkness could navigate safely. At the time, no one could have anticipated that this isolated location would soon become associated with one of the most enduring maritime mysteries in British history. Operating a lighthouse in such a remote location required careful planning and reliable personnel. The Northern Lighthouse Board assigned keepers who were experienced, disciplined, and accustomed to the demands of maritime work. Lighthouse keeping was not simply a technical role. It involved maintaining equipment, monitoring weather conditions, recording observations, and ensuring that the light operated continuously throughout the night. Any interruption could place ships at risk, so the responsibility carried significant weight. The lighthouse on the Flannan Isles was staffed by a team of 3 men at a time, with a 4th keeper remaining on shore as relief when rotations changed. This system allowed workers to spend several weeks on the island before returning to the mainland for rest and contact with family. Living and working in close proximity required cooperation and mutual respect, as disagreements could become difficult to manage in isolation. The men assigned to the Flannan station were considered capable and dependable, qualities essential for maintaining safety in such a challenging environment. At the time of the events, the 3 keepers stationed on the island were James Duquette, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. James Duquette served as the principal keeper, meaning he held primary responsibility for operations and decision-making. He was described as experienced and reliable, with a professional background that reflected years of maritime service. Thomas Marshall, the 2nd assistant, was also regarded as competent and attentive to duty. Both men had established records of steady work within the lighthouse service. Donald MacArthur, the 3rd keeper present, was working as a relief keeper during this rotation. Relief keepers were often assigned temporarily to cover absences or staffing needs, and MacArthur had prior experience in similar roles. Accounts later described him as physically strong and capable, though some reports suggested he had a more intense personality compared to the others. Personality differences are common in small working groups, particularly when individuals are placed in isolated environments for extended periods. Even so, there was no clear indication of serious conflict among the men before the events that followed. Daily life for lighthouse keepers followed structured routines designed to ensure reliability. Tasks included cleaning lenses, maintaining fuel supplies, checking mechanical systems, recording weather observations, and performing general upkeep of the station. Meals were prepared within the living quarters, and free time might involve reading, conversation, or simply observing the surrounding sea. Routine provided stability, helping keepers manage the psychological effects of isolation. Predictable schedules also ensured that responsibilities were completed without error. Communication with the mainland depended largely on scheduled supply visits, which occurred at intervals determined by weather and logistics. Keepers maintained logs documenting daily conditions and activities, which would later be reviewed by officials. These written records were important for both operational tracking and accountability. The expectation was that routines would continue without interruption until the next scheduled contact with the mainland. For Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur, life on the island initially followed these familiar patterns. They carried out responsibilities, recorded observations, and maintained the lighthouse as required. From the outside, everything appeared normal, with no immediate indication that anything unusual was occurring. Yet, within a short period of time, circumstances would change in ways that left behind unanswered questions, transforming the routine assignment of 3 lighthouse keepers into a mystery that would endure for generations. One of the most important sources of information about the final days of the lighthouse keepers comes from the station logs that were maintained as part of routine operations. Lighthouse keepers were required to document weather conditions, maintenance activities, and any notable events, creating an official record that could later be reviewed by supervisors. These entries were typically practical and brief, focused on operational details rather than personal reflection. However, the final entries associated with the Flannan Isles would later attract attention because of their timing and content. According to reports, entries in the days leading up to the disappearance described severe weather conditions affecting the island. Strong winds and heavy seas were noted, reflecting the challenging environment that lighthouse keepers were accustomed to managing. Storm conditions were not unusual in that region, particularly during winter months, but they still required vigilance and careful monitoring to ensure equipment remained secure and operational. The men were trained to respond to such conditions with discipline, following procedures designed to protect both themselves and the lighthouse. One entry reportedly described one of the keepers appearing unsettled by the weather, which has sometimes been interpreted as unusual given the experience level of the men involved. However, it is important to recognize that written records can be interpreted differently depending on context. Even experienced workers may express concern when conditions are particularly intense, and language that appears emotional in retrospect may have been routine at the time. Without additional context, it is difficult to determine the intended meaning behind specific phrases recorded in the log. The final recorded entry was dated December 15, 1900, indicating that routine operations were continuing at that time. There was no clear indication within the official log that something extraordinary had occurred. The lighthouse remained operational, and responsibilities appeared to be carried out according to expectations. This normality would later become one of the more puzzling aspects of the case, as the records did not provide immediate clues explaining what happened afterward. Communication beyond the written logs was limited. The island relied on scheduled visits from supply vessels to maintain contact with the mainland, meaning there were often periods without direct oversight. If unexpected events occurred between visits, the only record might be whatever the keepers had written in the logbook. This reliance on periodic contact contributed to the mystery, as there were gaps in knowledge between the last entry and the eventual discovery that something was wrong. Weather reports from nearby areas suggested that storms had indeed affected the region during that period, though interpretations of their severity have varied among later researchers. The sea around the Flannan Isles is known for sudden changes and powerful waves, and even experienced sailors treated the waters with caution. Environmental conditions would later become a central part of discussions about possible explanations, as natural forces were considered among the most likely contributing factors. At the time the final log entries were written, however, there was no indication that anything unusual had occurred beyond routine challenges associated with the environment. The keepers continued their duties, maintaining the lighthouse as expected. The absence of warning within the records would later deepen the sense of uncertainty, as observers were left to wonder how events could shift from ordinary routine to unexplained disappearance within such a short period of time. The lighthouse on the Flannan Isles depended on periodic visits from supply vessels to maintain operations. These ships delivered food, fuel, mail, and replacement equipment, while also transporting keepers to and from the mainland during scheduled rotations. Weather conditions often influenced the timing of these journeys, and delays were not unusual during winter months when storms could make landing dangerous or impossible. Despite these challenges, the arrival of a supply ship was normally a routine event, anticipated by the keepers as both practical support and brief connection to the outside world. In December 1900, the relief vessel assigned to visit the island was the steamer Hesperus, operating under the direction of the Northern Lighthouse Board. The ship was scheduled to reach the Flannan Isles earlier in the month, but severe weather conditions delayed the journey. Such delays were not considered alarming at first, as storms frequently disrupted maritime schedules. However, as days passed without confirmation from the lighthouse station, some concern began to develop among officials responsible for its operation. When the Hesperus finally approached the island on December 26th, the crew immediately noticed something unusual. According to reports, the lighthouse light had not been visible during the previous nights, which raised concern because the beacon was expected to operate continuously regardless of weather conditions. A functioning lighthouse served as a critical navigational aid, and any interruption suggested that something might be wrong at the station. Even before landing, this absence of light created uncertainty among those approaching the island. Captain James Harvey of the Hesperus attempted to signal the keepers upon arrival, following standard procedure. Normally, lighthouse staff would respond quickly to visual or audible signals, preparing to assist with unloading supplies and greeting the incoming crew. On this occasion, however, there was no response. The absence of activity was noticeable, particularly because keepers were expected to maintain awareness of approaching vessels. Still, harsh weather and island conditions sometimes delayed responses, so the situation was not immediately assumed to be serious. Due to rough sea conditions, the crew could not land immediately and had to wait for calmer conditions before sending a small boat ashore. Eventually, a shore party was organized, with relief keeper Joseph Moore volunteering to go ahead to the lighthouse. Moore had prior experience working at the station and was familiar with its routines, making him a logical choice to assess the situation. As he approached the island, the lack of visible activity became increasingly concerning. The journey up the steep path toward the lighthouse revealed more signs that something was not as expected. There were no workers visible outside, no movement near the landing area, and no indication that preparations were being made for the arrival of supplies. In remote environments, silence can carry particular weight, and the absence of routine activity suggested that the situation might involve more than simple delay or oversight. For the crew waiting offshore, uncertainty continued, while Moore made his way toward the station buildings. They expected that he would soon return with an explanation or signal indicating that operations were continuing normally. Instead, What he would discover inside the lighthouse complex would transform concern into one of the most enduring mysteries in maritime history, leaving questions that remain unanswered more than a century later. When Joseph Moore reached the lighthouse buildings, he encountered a scene that immediately suggested something was wrong. The main entrance door was closed, and upon entering, he found the interior quiet and undisturbed. There was no sign of the 3 keepers who were expected to be present. In remote locations, such as the Flannan Isles, workers were rarely far from the station itself, particularly during harsh winter weather, so the absence of all personnel was unusual and concerning. Moore began checking the rooms systematically, looking for any indication of where the men might have gone. Inside the living quarters, he observed signs that suggested normal activity had taken place before their disappearance. Beds appeared to have been used, and certain items were in their usual positions. However, there were also details that raised questions. Reports later mentioned that one of the kitchen chairs had been found overturned, and that a meal appeared to have been partially prepared or interrupted. These observations created the impression that something unexpected might have occurred suddenly. The lighthouse equipment itself was examined and found to be in proper working order, though the light had not been operating as expected when the ship approached. Mechanical systems did not show obvious signs of damage or malfunction, suggesting that the interruption was likely related to the absence of the keepers rather than equipment failure. Maintaining the light required regular attention, and without personnel present, it could not continue functioning normally. Moore also checked the exterior areas surrounding the station, where the conditions had been severe in the days before arrival, and the landscape showed evidence of strong winds and waves. Some equipment near the landing area appeared displaced, including ropes and storage boxes that might have been moved by heavy seas. The island's cliffs and shoreline were exposed to powerful ocean forces, and it was possible that conditions near the water had become dangerous. However, there was still no immediate sign of the keepers themselves. After completing his initial inspection, Moore returned to signal the Hesperus crew, indicating that the lighthouse was empty. The news created alarm among those waiting offshore, as the absence of all 3 keepers, without explanation, was highly unusual. The crew soon joined him on the island to conduct a more thorough search, examining buildings, pathways, and surrounding terrain. Despite their efforts, no trace of the men was found. The lack of evidence made the situation increasingly puzzling. There were no signs of struggle inside the buildings, no clear indication of where the keepers had gone, and no written message explaining their absence. In isolated workplaces, individuals sometimes leave temporarily for maintenance tasks or inspections, but it was highly unlikely that all 3 would abandon the station simultaneously, particularly during severe weather conditions. For those present on the island that day, the discovery created a sense of uncertainty that was difficult to resolve. The lighthouse stood silent against the surrounding ocean, its responsibilities momentarily interrupted, while the fate of the 3 men remained unknown. What had begun as a delayed supply visit had now become the starting point of a mystery that would continue to generate questions for generations, with no clear answer emerging despite later investigation. Following the discovery that the lighthouse was empty, officials from the Northern Lighthouse Board initiated a formal investigation to determine what might have happened to the 3 keepers. Maintaining lighthouse operations was a matter of public safety, and the unexplained absence of personnel required careful examination. The responsibility for reviewing the situation fell to Robert Muirhead, a superintendent with experience overseeing lighthouse stations and the procedures associated with their operation. His role involved assessing both environmental conditions and human factors that might explain the disappearance. Muirhead travelled to the Flannan Isles to inspect the site personally. During his visit, he examined the interior, the surrounding buildings, and the landing areas where equipment was stored. Observations confirmed that the station had been left unattended, with no indication that the keepers had planned to abandon their duties. The logbook entries suggested routine operations up until the final recorded date, and there were no messages indicating emergency circumstances. This absence of warning became one of the more puzzling elements of the case. Attention quickly turned toward environmental factors, particularly the weather conditions reported during the days preceding the disappearance. The island's exposed location made it vulnerable to powerful storms and sudden waves that could sweep across lower areas near the shore. Investigators noted that some equipment near the landing area appeared displaced, which suggested that severe seas may have reached parts of the island normally considered safe. If the keepers had gone outside to secure equipment during dangerous conditions, they could have been placed at significant risk. The possibility that one man encountered trouble and the others attempted a rescue was also considered. In isolated workplaces, cooperation is essential, and individuals often act quickly to assist co-workers in danger. If one keeper had been injured or swept toward the water, the others might have rushed to help without taking time to follow safety procedures. Such a sequence of events could explain why all three men disappeared simultaneously, leaving the station unattended. Muirhead's investigation also included examination of the lighthouse infrastructure itself. He confirmed that the equipment was functional and that there were no signs of mechanical failure that might have required unusual action from the keepers. This reinforced the likelihood that the cause was external rather than related to the lighthouse systems. Environmental forces remained the most plausible explanation, given the physical evidence and known conditions of the island. After reviewing available information, the official conclusions suggested that the men were likely lost due to a combination of severe weather and dangerous sea conditions. The theory proposed that they had gone outside to secure equipment or respond to storm damage and were swept away by waves. While this explanation could not be confirmed directly due to the absence of physical evidence, it aligned with known environmental risks associated with the location. Maritime environments can be unpredictable, and even experienced workers may encounter situations beyond their control. Despite the official conclusion, the absence of definitive proof left some uncertainty. Without witnesses or physical remains, questions remained about the precise sequence of events that occurred. Over time, this uncertainty contributed to speculation and alternative theories, though the investigation itself remained grounded in environmental and occupational risk factors. The disappearance of the three keepers became recorded as a tragic maritime incident, shaped by the harsh conditions of the island and the responsibilities carried by those who worked there. Following the official investigation, the most widely accepted explanations for the disappearance of the three lighthouse keepers focused on natural causes related to the environment of the Flannan Isles. The Atlantic waters surrounding the islands are known for their unpredictability, with sudden waves and powerful swells capable of reaching areas that may appear safe under normal conditions. Maritime history contains many examples of experienced workers encountering unexpected dangers, particularly when severe weather combines with exposed terrain. One of the primary theories suggested that the keepers had gone outside to secure equipment during a storm. Investigators had observed that some storage boxes and ropes near the landing area appeared displaced, which could indicate that heavy seas had affected the shoreline. If equipment was at risk of being lost or damaged, the men might have attempted to secure it, especially given their responsibility to maintain operational readiness. Such tasks, however, would have placed them close to the edge of cliffs or exposed rock surfaces where sudden waves could pose serious danger. The possibility of a rogue wave was also considered. Rogue waves are unusually large waves that can occur without much warning, sometimes reaching heights significantly greater than surrounding swells. In areas where ocean currents interact with underwater terrain, wave patterns can become complex and unpredictable. If a large wave struck while the keepers were near the shoreline, it could have swept one or more of them into the sea. The others might have attempted to assist, resulting in multiple individuals being lost within a short period of time. Weather reports from nearby locations indicated that storms had passed through the region around the time of the disappearance. While conditions may not have appeared extreme from distant observation points, localized weather on isolated islands can differ significantly. Wind direction, wave reflection from cliffs, and tidal patterns can create hazardous situations that are difficult to predict. Experienced lighthouse keepers were aware of these risks, but even familiarity with the environment cannot eliminate danger entirely. Another natural explanation involved the terrain itself. The Flannan Isles are characterized by steep slopes, wet rock surfaces, and uneven pathways that can become slippery during storms. A fall near the cliffs could easily result in severe injury or unconsciousness, especially if the individual landed near the waterline. In such a scenario, co-workers attempting a rescue might also place themselves at risk, particularly under time pressure. This sequence of events could explain how all 3 men disappeared without leaving clear signs behind. Some observers also considered the possibility that the men had been struck by debris moved by the storm, such as heavy equipment or loose materials carried by waves. Impact injuries could have occurred quickly, preventing the keepers from returning to the station. The absence of bodies was not considered unusual, given the strength of ocean currents in the area, which can carry objects far from their original location. Maritime recoveries are often difficult, especially during winter months when search conditions are challenging. While natural cause theories cannot provide precise details of what occurred, they align with known risks associated with isolated maritime work. The combination of responsibility, environmental exposure, and unpredictable weather creates conditions where accidents can happen despite experience and caution. For many investigators and historians, the explanation involving severe weather and waves remains the most plausible, even though uncertainty persists due to the lack of direct evidence. In addition to natural explanations involving weather and sea conditions, some researchers have considered psychological and environmental factors that might have influenced the events on the Flannan Isles. Working in isolated locations for extended periods can affect individuals in subtle ways, particularly when routines are repetitive and contact with the outside world is limited. Lighthouse keepers were trained to manage solitude, but even experienced workers can experience emotional strain when exposed to harsh environments for long durations. Isolation can influence perception and decision-making, especially when combined with environmental stressors, such as strong winds, darkness, and constant ocean noise. The human mind often relies on familiar sensory cues to maintain orientation and stability, and when those cues are limited or repetitive, awareness can shift. Fatigue, disrupted sleep, or prolonged stress may reduce attention to risk, potentially contributing to accidents. These factors do not imply unusual behavior, but rather highlight how environmental conditions can influence judgment in demanding workplaces. Group dynamics may also play a role in isolated settings. When small teams live and work together without outside contact, interpersonal relationships become particularly important. Cooperation is essential. But disagreements or misunderstandings can sometimes develop more quickly in confined environments. While there is no direct evidence suggesting conflict among the 3 keepers, the possibility of tension has occasionally been discussed in historical analysis, simply because interpersonal factors are part of any group situation. Even minor disagreements could influence decisions about how to respond to challenges, particularly under pressure. Environmental noise is another factor sometimes considered. The sound of waves striking cliffs, wind passing through structures, and mechanical vibrations from equipment can create a constant background of sensory input. Over time, repetitive noise can contribute to fatigue or distraction, especially when combined with demanding responsibilities. Maintaining focus in such conditions requires discipline, and moments of inattention may increase vulnerability to accidents, particularly near hazardous areas of the island. Sleep patterns in remote workplaces can also differ from those on the mainland. Lighthouse keepers often worked rotating schedules to maintain continuous operation of the light, which could involve irregular sleep hours. Disrupted sleep cycles may affect reaction time, concentration, and mood, all of which influence safety. If the keepers were tired or managing fatigue during a period of severe weather, their ability to assess risk accurately could have been reduced. Psychological explanations do not necessarily contradict environmental theories, but instead complement them by providing context for human behavior under stress. The combination of isolation, fatigue, environmental noise, and responsibility may create circumstances where decisions are made quickly in response to perceived threats, such as equipment damage or storm impact. These rapid decisions, particularly near hazardous terrain, can lead to unintended consequences. Ultimately, psychological and environmental considerations highlight how complex the situation may have been. Rather than a single cause, multiple factors could have interacted to produce the outcome. While no definitive conclusion can be drawn, examining human responses to isolation and environmental stress helps provide a broader understanding of the conditions faced by the lighthouse keepers during their final days on the island. As the years passed and the disappearance remained unexplained, stories and speculation gradually began to surround the events on the Flannan Isles. Situations involving mystery and isolation often invite imaginative interpretations, particularly when there are few witnesses and limited physical evidence. The absence of definitive answers created space for rumors to develop, some grounded loosely in facts, and others shaped more by folklore and storytelling traditions. One category of speculation focused on unusual or unexpected events that might have occurred on the island itself. Some narratives suggested sudden conflict among the keepers, while others imagined accidents involving equipment or environmental hazards that were never fully documented. These theories often reflected attempts to fill gaps in knowledge with plausible scenarios, rather than evidence-based conclusions. When people encounter incomplete information, the human mind naturally seeks patterns or explanations, sometimes constructing narratives that feel satisfying even without confirmation. Local folklore also influenced how the mystery was interpreted. Remote islands and Scottish waters have long been associated with legends involving spirits, sea creatures, or unexplained disappearances. While there is no evidence connecting such stories directly to the Flannan Isles incident, cultural context can shape how events are remembered. Communities sometimes incorporate real incidents into existing folklore, blending fact and imagination over time. This process can transform historical events into stories that carry symbolic meaning rather than purely factual detail. Another area of speculation involved maritime hazards beyond ordinary storms, such as rogue waves or unusual ocean conditions. Although these explanations remain grounded in natural phenomena, the dramatic nature of the environment encouraged storytelling that emphasized danger and unpredictability. The Atlantic Ocean has historically inspired both respect and fear, and narratives about sudden tragedy at sea are common within maritime culture. The disappearance of 3 experienced keepers fit into this broader pattern of stories associated with ocean risk. Some writers and commentators also explored more imaginative ideas, suggesting possibilities that extended beyond conventional explanations. These narratives often appeared in popular media or fictionalized accounts, where the goal was to capture public interest rather than provide historical analysis. Over time, such portrayals contributed to the mystery's reputation, even though they were not supported by evidence. The distinction between documented fact and creative interpretation can become blurred when stories are retold repeatedly across generations. The role of uncertainty itself contributed to ongoing fascination. Mysteries without clear resolution tend to remain in public consciousness because they invite curiosity and personal interpretation. Each new retelling can emphasize different aspects, whether environmental danger, human psychology, or imaginative speculation. In the case of the Flannan Isles, The combination of isolation, sudden disappearance, and lack of witnesses created an enduring narrative that people continue to revisit. Despite the rumors and legends, historical investigation has consistently returned to natural explanations as the most plausible cause. Nevertheless, the presence of speculation reflects how human culture responds to unanswered questions. Stories grow around gaps in knowledge, shaped by imagination, belief, and the passage of time. The disappearance of the lighthouse keepers therefore became more than a maritime incident. It evolved into a mystery that continues to capture attention, blending history with storytelling in a way that keeps the events alive in public memory. The disappearance of the 3 lighthouse keepers on the Flannan Isles did not only create a lasting mystery, it also prompted reflection within maritime authorities about safety procedures and operational practices for isolated lighthouse stations. When unexpected incidents occur in professional environments, organizations often review protocols to determine whether improvements can reduce future risks. In this case, the Northern Lighthouse Board and other maritime organizations considered how working conditions and safety measures might be strengthened for keepers stationed in remote locations. One area of focus involved procedures for working near hazardous shorelines during severe weather. The Flannan Isles were known for unpredictable waves and strong winds, and it was possible that the keepers had approached the shoreline to secure equipment during dangerous conditions. After the incident, greater emphasis was placed on minimizing situations where multiple workers might be exposed simultaneously to environmental hazards. Guidance encouraged careful assessment of risk before leaving the safety of the station buildings, particularly during storms. Equipment storage practices were also reviewed. Investigators had noted that some equipment near the landing area appeared displaced, suggesting that waves may have reached higher ground than expected. Ensuring that tools and supplies were secured more effectively became an important consideration. Improved storage methods could reduce the likelihood that workers would need to respond urgently to shifting equipment during hazardous conditions, thereby decreasing exposure to danger. Communication procedures between lighthouse stations and mainland authorities were another topic of discussion. Although scheduled supply visits were standard practice, extended gaps between contact points could delay awareness of problems. Over time, technological advancements allowed for more reliable communication systems, including radio equipment that enabled faster reporting of unusual situations. While these developments occurred gradually as technology improved, the lessons from incidents like the Flannan disappearance reinforced the importance of maintaining consistent contact. Staffing policies also evolved as maritime safety practices advanced. The presence of multiple keepers was already intended to provide mutual support, but the possibility that all 3 men had disappeared simultaneously highlighted the need for careful coordination when responding to external hazards. Ensuring that at least one individual remained within the station during risky operations became an important consideration. In later safety thinking, such measures aimed to reduce the chance of total absence from critical positions. More broadly, the incident contributed to awareness of the psychological and environmental challenges faced by workers in isolated locations. Isolation, fatigue, and harsh weather can interact in ways that increase vulnerability, even among experienced professionals. Recognizing these factors encouraged ongoing attention to worker well-being and operational procedures, both in lighthouse service and in other remote occupations. Over time, improvements in infrastructure and automation would reduce reliance on constant human presence in many lighthouses, further changing the nature of the profession. While it is impossible to know whether specific changes were directly caused by the Flannan Isles incident alone, the disappearance became part of the historical context influencing maritime safety awareness. Organizations often learn collectively from past events, integrating lessons into evolving procedures. In that sense, the legacy of the 3 keepers extended beyond mystery. contributing indirectly to ongoing efforts aimed at protecting those who work in challenging and isolated environments. Over the decades following the disappearance of the 3 lighthouse keepers, the events on the Flannan Isles gradually moved from immediate concern into historical memory. Yet, unlike many maritime incidents that fade into obscurity, this case continued to attract attention because of the unanswered questions it left behind. The combination of isolation, sudden disappearance, and lack of witnesses created a narrative that remained compelling long after the official investigation had concluded. As time passed, the story became part of maritime history as well as popular culture. Writers, historians, and storytellers revisited the mystery repeatedly, each bringing their own perspective to the events. Some accounts focused on the practical realities of lighthouse work and environmental risk, emphasizing the harsh conditions faced by the keepers. Others explored the emotional and psychological aspects of isolation, considering how human behavior might be influenced by remote environments. These interpretations often reflected the broader interests of the authors, shaping how readers understood the case. Poetry and literature also played a role in sustaining public awareness. One well-known example is the poem inspired by the disappearance, which presented the events in a dramatic and symbolic way, rather than a strict historical record. Artistic representations can influence perception because they emphasize emotion and imagination, sometimes blending fact with creative interpretation. Over time, these cultural portrayals contributed to the enduring sense of mystery associated with the Flannan Isles. The lighthouse itself eventually became automated, reflecting technological changes that reduced the need for constant human presence in remote stations. Automation represented progress in maritime safety, allowing navigation aids to function reliably without requiring workers to live in isolation. However, the physical structure remained a reminder of the past, standing against the Atlantic winds much as it had when the 3 men disappeared. For visitors and observers, the lighthouse became associated not only with navigation, but also with the unresolved questions connected to its history. Public fascination with the mystery has persisted into modern times, supported by documentaries, articles, and discussions exploring possible explanations. Advances in understanding oceanography, weather patterns, and occupational safety have provided additional context, yet no definitive answer has emerged. The absence of conclusive evidence allows multiple interpretations to coexist, which is often the case in historical mysteries, where records are limited. Curiosity continues because uncertainty remains. For many people, the story resonates because it highlights the vulnerability of human life in the face of natural forces. The ocean environment can be both beautiful and unpredictable, and even experienced individuals can encounter situations beyond their control. The disappearance of the keepers serves as a reminder of the risks faced by those who worked to ensure the safety of others, maintaining lights that guided ships through dangerous waters. Ultimately, the legacy of the Flannan Isles mystery lies not only in what happened, but in what remains unknown. The story invites reflection on isolation, responsibility, and the limits of human understanding. More than a century later, the lighthouse continues to stand as a quiet symbol of unanswered questions, while the memory of the 3 keepers endures as part of maritime history, carried forward through generations of retelling and contemplation. As we come to the end of this story, what remains most noticeable is the quiet uncertainty that surrounds it. 3 individuals carried out their duties in a remote place, following routines that had likely felt familiar and predictable. Then, within a short period of time, those routines stopped, leaving behind questions that could not be fully answered. Situations like this remind us that even in environments shaped by discipline and responsibility, life can change unexpectedly. Mysteries that occur in isolated settings often leave a lasting impression because there are fewer details to guide understanding. Without witnesses or clear explanations, the mind naturally searches for possibilities, sometimes returning to the same questions again and again. Over time, however, uncertainty itself becomes part of the story, encouraging reflection rather than resolution. The passage of years softens urgency, leaving space for quiet curiosity instead of concern. For listeners, stories like this can offer a gentle opportunity to observe human experience from a distance. The steady rhythm of narration allows thoughts to slow, creating a sense of calm that contrasts with the unpredictability described in the events. There is no need to decide what explanation feels most likely. You can simply allow the story to exist as it is, a moment in history shaped by environment, responsibility, and unanswered questions. If you found this story relaxing or helpful for winding down tonight, you are always welcome here. Subscribing to the channel and leaving a like supports the creation of more calm, long-form documentaries designed for rest and quiet listening. Your presence helps this space continue to grow for others, who may also be looking for peaceful stories at the end of the day. Now, as the narrative fades into the background, you might notice your breathing becoming slower and more steady. The sounds around you are soft, the night is calm, and there is nothing more you need to focus on. You can simply rest, allowing thoughts to drift gently, while sleep approaches naturally and comfortably.